Hi everyone, nice to see you. We do have 150 people registered for this event, so we expect some of these seats to fill, but we have a lot to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Dale. I direct the Climate and Society Master's Program here at the Climate School. I know I see several of my students out here in the audience. And I'm going to be joined up here for this first hour of the workshop today by Dr. Bruyninckx, who's here, and he will introduce himself, I think, when he gets up in the second half of the introduction. So welcome, we're really glad to have you. And here's where we're going today. So we're here for a 2-hour workshop. The first hour is Dr. Bruyninckx and myself, and we're going to give you some of the background and context for the COP to set up how did we get here. We're about to have COP 29 beginning in a couple of weeks. We're going to lay some of that groundwork. I'll describe the UNFCCC. We'll talk about some of the global climate treaties that we've had, and by some I mean the only two we've had, which is the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And then we'll do a little bit of an intro into how the COPs are structured, the blue zone and the green zone, what happens in each of those. We'll show you some photos. And then Dr. Bruyninckx will come up, and his work with the European Union has really been on the inside of the negotiations, and he'll share that perspective. That's the first hour of this workshop. We aim to finish that within about 45 minutes and have some time for Q&A, any questions you may have. The second hour of the workshop is a panel discussion, and we'll be joined by 2 of our students and another faculty member from across campus in the health department to talk about. Everybody on that panel has extensive experiences at the COP. We'll hear from some different perspectives and different points of view. So that's the program. Those students of mine, these first 3 or 4 slides will look familiar, so just a heads up. So in my class on climate change adaptation, we cover some of this essential governance and institution information about climate change and climate change policy. So to tell the story of the COP, we have to first unpack what a COP is and what that means, and that gets us right away talking about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC. This is I call this a sorta kinda treaty. I don't know, I'd be interested in how Dr. Bruyninckx characterizes this. It's an agreement among 197 states, and it's been around since 1992. It was the outcome of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And the states that signed on to this agreement agreed to have an ongoing conversation about climate change. There's not a lot of to-dos to be part of the UNFCCC, but it serves as this really important foundational framework. The COP, the annual conference of the parties, comes from the UNFCCC. The parties to the UNFCCC are the parties that meet every year at the conference of the parties. So that's what COP means. And those of you who sort of speak UN language know there are COPs for many different UN treaties. Biodiversity COP just, I think, wrapped up. And this just means conference of the parties to whatever the treaty is. Now, the prominence of the climate change COP means that we more and more just for shorthand say the COP. And maybe we mean the climate change COP. But that is what we mean. This is a photo of the COP from a couple years ago in Egypt. I was there. This is at Sharm el-Sheikh. And that was COP 27. We're leading into now COP 29. That means the parties of this treaty, sort of kind of treaty, have been meeting for 29 years, every year since 1992. The objective of the UNFCCC, as stated, is to stabilize greenhouse gases at a level that would prevent anthropogenic interference with the climate system. I kind of like putting this up here because it reminds us of how recently our understanding of climate change has come about. As recently as 1992, we, really everybody, believed we genuinely could prevent climate change from happening. Now we know we did not succeed at that, but this was still the founding document that established the UNFCCC, and it's helpful to remember that's what started the COPs. So the UNFCCC established a few really important principles that continue to guide the way climate policy functions. It established the common but differentiated responsibility principle. This is the idea that not all of the 197 parties, those are countries, we call those states in the international system, not every party to the treaty has an equal responsibility for emissions that contributed to climate change, they also don't have equal capacity to respond. So the common but differentiated responsibility principle talks about or is referring to two different dimensions of ways in which there are differences among parties. Some states, mostly the wealthier industrialized states, have primary responsibility historically for emitting greenhouse gases. Those same states are likely the ones that have a greater capacity to respond to impacts. So we have a highly inequitable and asymmetrical system out there. And the UNFCCC begins with that acknowledgement. It goes on to say that given these asymmetries, those industrialized countries that bear most of the responsibility for emissions are the most important actors to mitigate those emissions. That makes good sense, it's logical. And developing countries, poorer countries who did not go through a greenhouse gas-driven industrialization process, maybe focus more on adapting to the impacts from climate change. The UNFCCC in its early years created a couple of other important pieces that still remain in the architecture of the global policy framework. Created the Global Environment Facility, which was one of the first financing tools. We now have many, but this was the beginning of the idea that we need funds that are set aside specifically to tackle climate change. And it was an acknowledgement, even very early, of how expensive this was going to be. The UNFCCC also began what has now become very robust reporting. In 1992, we had barely an idea of who was emitting what, which sectors were responsible. We now have reams of data on emission sources, emission sinks, and countries, et cetera. So that all kind of dates back to the UNFCCC. In 1997, so 5 years after the UNFCCC, the very first global treaty on climate change was enacted, called the Kyoto Protocol. Only called the Kyoto Protocol because that's the city where it was signed. It was the first global climate treaty, and it built on the common but differentiated responsibility principle to create a system that tried to operationalize the idea that the polluter should pay. Right? So we have a differentiated responsibility for emissions. We can say the industrialized, wealthy countries bear more responsibility. They're the polluters. The Kyoto Protocol took it a step farther and said they're the ones who should mitigate their emissions. And it divided the world, all countries, into two categories. The first category is called Annex 1. These were countries that had legally binding mitigation targets in the Kyoto Protocol. The other category, very helpfully titled the non-Annex 1 countries, do not have binding mitigation targets in the Kyoto Protocol. As you can see from the map up here, almost every country in the world signed and ratified this treaty with one glaring exception. The US signed the treaty, but we have a second step in our ratification process in this country, some countries have this, that requires a vote of the Senate. And the Senate, I believe unanimously, bipartisan, voted it down. Did not agree to participate in the Kyoto Protocol, and as a result, the US is not a party to this treaty. There are a number of reasons why this is, and we can talk about that later if you have questions about that. But the US not participating in this treaty process dealt a real blow to its effectiveness and success over time, because the US is one of the largest emitters, and at this time was the largest emitter on the planet. And not participating in the treaty took a lot of the wind out of the sails. We can fast forward to 2015 to a second try at a climate treaty. Under the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of progress began, especially, I would say, in Western Europe and some other parts of the world where they took this on, became parties to the treaty, and began to implement mitigation measures. But it was incomplete, and the US was not part of this process. So a new treaty with a new treaty structure was established in 2015, and this is the Paris Agreement. These are the celebrants at COP21. So now we know, right, here's COP21 is where the Paris Agreement was launched in 2015. It creates a climate treaty that is built on a totally different kind of system. Instead of the Kyoto Protocol, where binding targets came top down, It asks every country to develop its own contribution, intended contributions, to solving our shared climate problem. These are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Initially, when the Paris Agreement was created, countries were encouraged to submit what were then called intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs. As soon as the treaty became enacted and was happening, intended drops off, and we have NDCs. The text of the Paris Agreement relies overwhelmingly on these bottom-up NDCs that every country created for itself. So it's a very different model for a treaty, and it was intended to be USA-proof, because there's nothing to ratify. The US said voluntarily, here's what we understand as the climate change threats we face. Here's what we intend to contribute to our shared global problem. These are voluntary. These are bottom-up contributions. And baked into the idea of a treaty that rests on these NDCs is the idea that countries can continue to modify and get more ambitious with their goals. That these NDCs are dynamic living documents, and that the Paris Agreement therefore has a sort of long lifespan, because we can keep modifying within the scaffolding of that treaty. This is the treaty system we're operating under today. The treaty system, this treaty began with an agreement initially that we, the globe, could not allow planet to warm more than 2 degrees Celsius. In 2015, that was the agreement. Pretty quickly thereafter, scientists revised that and said actually 1.5 degrees is really a number we're more comfortable with, beyond which we start to reach irreversible damage and tipping points. So countries were asked to target their NDCs at this shared goal of not warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have, in many parts of the world, already exceeded that. The Paris Agreement also made climate change adaptation more prominent. Climate finance began to grow and expand through this treaty. And part of the Paris Agreement is that every 5 years, we have this global stocktake. That's what it's called. And it's intended to bring countries back together at the COP to take another hard look at their NDCs and see if they can do more. Take stock together and escalate ambition. How's it going? How's the Paris Agreement going so far with implementation? Progress has been uneven. Some countries have made more progress than others. Many countries have now updated their NDCs already since 2015. Many, if not most countries, are on at least their second version of their NDC. But countries are facing real and important barriers toward achieving the entirety of their own NDCs. For example, some of the barriers they face prominently are capacity barriers. They may not be achieving the goals they set for themselves because they lack the funding to do it, they lack the expertise to do it, they lack the equipment and the technology to do it. Those are capacity weaknesses. They're being asked to both mitigate and adapt. It's a lot. And some countries are having trouble prioritizing and taking all of that on in meaningful ways. We also know that domestic politics can interfere. We don't need to look any further than this country to see how that can matter. And we're not the only country that has changing administrations with different attitudes about climate change. And those cause real bumps in the road for steady progress. There's also been a lot of attention, and we'll talk more about this later today, to the problem of loss and damage, which is that countries are suffering expensive losses and damages now from climate change. Those impacts are real and present and beginning to cost countries a lot of money. Those expenses, those damages are interfering with countries' ability to do more. They're busy sort of cleaning up, right? So the impacts themselves from climate change are in some ways contributing to the lack of progress on climate change, right? We're a little bit stuck in that loop. This brings us to COP29, which will be in Azerbaijan, in Baku. Next week it begins, I think November 11th, so 2 weeks from now. That's COP29. So let me tell you a little bit about how a COP is laid out. The COP, as a starting point, always has 2 zones, a blue zone and a green zone. And what these are the badges. When you go to a COP, you get a badge, and your badge signifies which areas you have access to, where you're allowed to enter. In the blue zone, these are accredited. So when you hear people say, oh, I have a badge to go to the COP, what they mean is they have a badge that gets them into the blue zone. You have to be accredited to be in the blue zone. So it's to parties. These are states that have delegations. And then there is a category called observers who are also accredited and able to enter the blue zone. This is where the real action is happening with heads of state. Negotiations are happening in the blue zone. There are a lot of side events, panel events, cultural events, dancing events, all kinds of things are happening. It's gigantic. I can't overstate this. It's held in gigantic convention centers on a campus, and there's really a million things happening. It's attended by 199 parties now. That's 198 states, plus the EU gets its own badges. And a number of observers attend, and the media, of course, is also there. So this is the blue zone, very busy. The green zone is for non-accredited attendees. Or if you're accredited, you can still hang out in the green zone, but you don't need a badge to get in. And it's managed by the COP presidency, so it looks a little different every year. Every year the COP is held in a different city, and that city decides how the green zone will be organized and where it will be located. This tends to be the place where NGOs, civil society, youth groups, and the private sector, indigenous groups are able to hold advocacy events, organizing events, and all sorts of other climate change related conversations a little bit outside of the main venue. It can be really close or it can be really far away. Let me tell you a little more about the blue zone. The party delegations from each state vary a lot in size and in capacity. And this is a really important feature of climate change policy. As we said, it's a bit asymmetrical. And when you go to a COP and you see big countries with hundreds of people in their delegations, and all those hundreds of people have their own laptops, and they have equipment, and they have assistants, and they have secretaries, and they're really equipped to participate in negotiations. And you compare that with a smaller state that can maybe afford to send 3 people, and they don't have administrative support, and maybe they have 1 laptop to share. You can see right away that the negotiations are starting on sort of uneven ground, right? So this is happening in the blue zone. Countries are there to represent their own national interests and have conversations with other countries. Some countries, if they can afford it, pavilions are expensive, have pavilions like this. Here's Senegal's pavilion from a few years ago, but you walk around these big warehouse rooms and there's pavilions everywhere, countries hosting their own. Observers, civil society organizations also may set up pavilions. And then there's always side events. So here's an example of a side event. Panel discussions are side events. These are really tightly managed and in high demand. So you can submit a side event, and then it's a competitive process. The most recent numbers I have, there were more than 4,000 applications for side events in 2022. I think that's probably roughly accurate for every year. And we end up with, I don't know, a couple hundred over the course of the 2-week COP. There are also plenary sessions, which are the really big events for heads of state that everybody is invited to, and they're done in sort of UN fashion with, you can put an earpiece in and get translations of languages, and there are a lot of resources at those events. And everyday schedules are sort of in the hallway. It looks a little bit like this. You can see in these events, these are plenaries, where they are these meetings open or closed? So when you attend a COP, if you're walking around, you can find these all over, and you can decide where you want to go next, and the meetings are structured and held all over the facility. What about the green zone? The green zone looks maybe a little bit more like this. These photos are all taken from the green zone. This one's actually from right outside in Egypt at Sharm el-Sheikh. And the green zone, again, is for non-accredited attendees, or again, if you're accredited, you're still allowed to go to the green zone, but you don't need a badge to be there. It tends to be the center place for advocacy and activism. We see a lot of that in the green zone. And I mentioned this before, it can be located really close to the blue zone, which I think it will be this year in Baku. I've seen the map. But in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was so far away, I never even saw it at that COP, right? And that's also an indicator of something. It's maybe an indicator of the comfort with civil society and protest in that host country. It's maybe an indicator of the value being placed on advocates and non-accredited attendees, but it is quite different. Also at the COP, since everybody shows up for the COP and everybody's in town, many organizations have side events that happen off-site because we're limited in space once you're inside the COP. And so these sort of adjacent events are really a part of the COP experience, and they may happen in nearby hotels or venues or other meeting spaces. So for example, for many years, there was an event called Climate and Development Days. I used to go to this every year at the COP. It was 2 days, then it was 1 day. Now I think it's maybe not even happening anymore because the idea of development has really been now infused into the COP in more integrated ways. But this was an event that would happen on the sides, on the margins of the COP every year. Here's another example. This was at Sharm el-Sheikh, so Columbia University and the business school, so the climate school and the business school together. I was at this event. I think this is my hand right here. See, I'm in the photo. There was a roundtable discussion, and we talked about educating the next generation of climate leaders, which is all of you in this room. This is a perfect example of an adjacent event. We weren't inside the COP venue, but we took advantage of having people there who were interested in this subject who showed up at our event and were able to share information. With all that groundwork now established, I'm happy to hand this over to Dr. Bruyninckx, who's going to talk a little bit more about sort of the inner sanctum of the blue zone.
All right, thanks Lisa for setting the scene. I'm Hans Bruyninckx. I used to be the director of the European Environment Agency. I'm now a professor at University of Antwerp. I've been to a dozen COPs as part of the EU delegation and the Belgian delegation. I will be at the next COP as part of the Belgian delegation. So I will speak primarily, okay, wow, this is happening. Technology is the solution. I will speak primarily from my own experience, which means that my experience is based in representing primarily the EU and Belgium, but as an academic, I've reflected quite a bit on what that means from a broader perspective. And I would say if you go to a COP, you have to be ready to be introduced to the wonderful world of a whole bunch of stuff that you don't really understand. It takes time to understand it. It's institutional complexity, it is acronyms galore, it's parallel processes, there is not one negotiation process, actor constellations that are really opaque and bizarre at first, so you have to get used to it. Yeah? And actually, without getting into anything here, but there is not one COP. Okay? The COP is the COP of UNFCCC. There is also the COP of the Conference of the Parties of the Kyoto Protocol and then of the Paris Agreement. The US is not part of the Kyoto one. The Paris Agreement, President Trump pulled out. I mean, so it's different constellations. All of them have their own acronyms, their own logic, and they're all taking place at the same time with the same actors, but in different ways. So don't get sidetracked by this. Focus on the issues. Because if you focus on the issue, you will understand why people are in the room with what type of position. If you focus on the institutional architecture, it's much more easy to get lost. Okay, acronyms, I've just put a couple up here. Some are very well established, like the Global Climate Fund, GCF, the stocktake, which Lisa Dale mentioned and is happening. Some are very typical for every COP, like the first one, the BICFIT, the Baku Initiative for Climate Finance, Investment and Trade. It's a new thing that pops up now. And I ended by AO call, it's any other combination of letters. Yeah, you will meet acronyms without end. Yeah, and it's a status thing almost. The most seasoned negotiators will sort of overwhelm others with their endless use of acronyms, knowing very well that if you're a grad student and you're running around there and you want to understand what's going on, you don't understand. I don't like that. I think it's a power game, but this is part of the whole thing, yeah? Okay, so what is also part of the whole thing is that these countries do not meet as individualized countries. And I'll start from my own experience. The EU is working as a group. So the biggest pavilion usually at the COP, or one of the biggest ones, is the EU pavilion, because it hosts 27 countries. It still pains me to say 27 after Brexit. It used to be 28. But 27 countries, the European Parliament is there, the Commission is there, it's really big. That's one group. But then you have the really big group is the G77 plus China. It's usually called the developing countries, G77 plus China. Not all developing countries or countries of the global south, if you prefer that, are in that group. Not all countries there are what I would label historically developing countries, because who also walks out of that room when they meet is some of the wealthiest countries on the planet, the oil states. Yeah, you have another big and important group is AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, not because they represent a lot of people, but they are a bit the moral compass in some of the discussions, because they are the ones that will disappear the earliest, that's the language, and they have a lot of loss and damage, whilst they have not contributed hardly anything to the causes. So all of these groups, they meet in separate rooms during the day, during the night, they have their positioning, it's part of the game. Yeah? So that's another thing you need to know when you go to a COP. Now, the host country and the secretariat are two important parts. They have separate roles. Yeah, the host country, they apply to have a COP. It's really a bit politically discussed and questioned why in the last decade we've had so many oil countries that have been organizing COPs. At the same time, it always opens a lot of space for debate on the role of the fossil fuel sector in the transition to a climate neutral sort of world. So there's a lot to be said there. If you look at the host country, it chairs the conference. The choice of the chair is really important and symbolic and hotly debated. They do all the preparation. They are responsible for some of the diplomacy. The chair usually sets up a group of countries that are called the Friends of the Chair. And they are countries that have the trust of many other actors and can be sent into the group of 77 plus China, or can be sent into the European constellation or the OPEC countries, because they should be able to maneuver through the process and assist there. They also are responsible for a lot of the communication and at the end for the final text. Yeah. Then you have the Secretariat of the UNFCCC, which is located in Bonn, the previous capital of West Germany. They are continuously monitoring the process. And if you think that a COP is a 2-week meeting, there is a pre-COP in Bonn. And in between the pre-COP and the previous meeting, there are technical meetings. These negotiations are an ongoing set of dialogues. It's never stopping. Yeah? So the Secretariat also plays the role of guardian of the process. They have access to all the relevant documentation and information, and they are the institutional memory, which you cannot expect from the host country. The UN is present in all of its capacities. Yeah? Anything that starts with UN and then some other letters, they're all there, because climate change is now relevant for the whole UN system. UNEP, obviously, the Secretary General is always very visible, especially in the second week. UNDP, the development program, the CBD people of biodiversity COP, which was just in Cali, will be very visible at this COP because of the linkage of the two issues. The CCD people, that's the other Rio Convention on combating desertification, they will be there because the land issue is increasingly central, and so on and so on, okay? So, what are the expected results of a negotiation? Well, first of all, we need to take procedural steps that are embedded in these treaties, yeah? That's important, and so we do that, stock taking, all of these things. But secondly, there's also implementation steps, yeah? We have a treaty, how do we implement now? Which mechanisms do we use? What rules do we design? How do we communicate this? Who is going to follow this up? This is the nuts and bolts of these treaties, so we discussed that. Finance mechanisms, they are the oil in the machinery, and to overcome any unovercomable, I am not sure that's an English word, but bear with me, unovercomable difficulty, we usually invent a new financial mechanism in the last 10 years. So they are really important in the whole thing. They broaden the scope, these texts. They have included increasingly adaptation. They've included now loss and damage. They are including biodiversity issues, health issues, gender issues. All of these things have been included, so broadening the scope. Embedding new knowledge, the whole idea of tipping points, planetary boundaries, moving from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, is embedding new understanding of how Earth systems and climate systems work. They come with new ambition. Yeah, that's also part of a final text. Like for the first time in the previous COP, the terminology of phasing down fossil fuels, yeah? You can say, did it really take 30 years to put that in a final text where it's obviously the central issue to some extent? Yes, it did, because these final texts have to be approved unanimously by all the parties there. So you can imagine how this works, and that's then the final document that comes out. How does a day like that work at a COP? Yeah, well, from my own experience, you get up really early in the morning and you go to your country briefing, which is usually with the head of delegation. It's a public official. If the ministers are there, it's the ministers and the rest of the delegation, the negotiators. What has happened yesterday, overnight, because it's almost 24/7 that it happens. What do we take to the next steps? Who is responsible for that? Debriefing, positioning. Then in the EU, I should go back, in the EU, there is the group meeting. It's usually at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. All countries of the EU, the Commissioner for Climate Change, the leading country in the EU, and we discuss EU positioning. Because we always come with one position of 27 countries. Imagine that discussion, yeah? No, but I mean, it's a serious point. It's not always easy, yeah? Then there are a bunch of ad hoc meetings. In an EU setting, they will say, okay, last night at 2 o'clock in the morning, Brazil blocked this or that. Who is going to pick that up? Sweden? Yeah, I know the minister rather well, and my chief negotiator is on the topic. So Sweden, could you reach out to the Brazilian minister, set up an ad hoc meeting? People are listening in, support staff. They immediately contact the support staff because there is a telephone book yay thick, yeah, because you need to be able to reach people. So that's how it's set up, ad hoc meetings. Then the actual negotiations. For the EU, we have negotiators for the EU. It can be a Belgian, a Maltese, a Hungarian, or a Greek negotiator. On that topic, the EU has one position, one negotiator, and goes into the actual talks. What happens there? Endless texts full of brackets. You need to understand the logic of bracketology, yeah? So, the whole goal at the end of the 2 weeks is to have texts without brackets. And every bracket has footnotes, and this country says that country says that. You need to agree on it. And it's terminology that then has implications for implementation. Then there are interim briefings during the day, and the plenary meetings, which were mentioned by Lisa, and this goes round the clock. Yeah. So if you're a good delegation head, you tell your people not to burn themselves in the first week, because the second week is the high politics week, and take a rest and go to sleep. And there are even delegations with beds in their delegation offices, because I mean, you're dead by the end of the 2 weeks. You're completely burnt. Yeah, that's the way it works. Then different roles. The second week, high-level segment, ministerial. There's a diplomatic level with heads of delegations and other high-ranking officials. You've got the actual technical negotiators and back office. My agency, the European Environment Agency, we were negotiators on some issues, but also back office. We had a genius who had access to the modeling, and if our negotiators would come back and say, China has promised to do that, he would plug it into the model and check what it would mean. Yeah? You need that sort of back office. Vanuatu and Malawi don't have that back office. Yeah? So this different way of doing that. Yeah? The EU delegation has a rotating presidency. Every 6 months, Europe has another presidency country. So that leads the delegation. You've got the EU commissioner. It's like the minister of the EU for climate action. It's a Dutch commissioner at this moment. DG Klima, it's the Directorate General for Climate Action. It's the administration, you could say, for climate action, with the head that is there. Then the countries who are there as negotiators and at ministerial level. You've got a European Parliament's delegation, because we want democratic legitimacy, which is not the case for quite a number of countries. They don't need democratic legitimacy because it's not part of how they function. Yeah. And we've got a whole EU support system with the European Environment Agency, but also the Investment Bank, a scientific advisory board. I mean, all of these elements are part of the European delegation. Yeah. What do we want in COPs? Well, climate neutrality by 2050, that's our position. We have a legally binding framework for that in Europe. Keeping the 1.5 degree alive, that's the technical language that is used now. That's the coded language to say we should still be able to make that. Science-based, very clearly, yeah. Then we have the link with financial mechanisms, where Europe is trying to focus completely on the LDCs, the least developed countries, mostly African countries, some Asian countries. And that is a way, you could say, with a cynical voice, to split up the G77 plus China, because you want to reach out to where we think funds are most needed, and not to countries that have GDPs per capita higher than Europe. And we are looking for alliances. Europe tries to be a bridge builder and building alliances. Yeah? What to expect for this next COP? A new collective quantified goal. I wrote it in full, but it's an acronym, of course, based on the global stocktake and how we can stay within that 1.5. What we have on the table today is not enough. We are going to a 3 to 3.5 world, which is a different world. Yeah? So we need to ramp up ambition. New national climate action plans and NDCs that are aligned with this global stocktake lack of ambition until now. Loss and damage fund, which was fundamentally agreed but needs flesh to the bone and procedures. This is really important and is going to be extremely difficult to discuss. Carbon markets, Article 6. How do we work with pricing carbon and then doing that in a global economy that has global flows of goods and services and energy and of impacts of climate, but needs properly organized also national markets. This is not going to be an easy thing. And there is this promise of tripling renewable energy by 2030. Well, the good news is that the uptake of renewable energy is faster than in our modeling. It's also faster than the International Energy Agency thought it would be, and for the so many year in a row. But tripling by 2030 will mean that there needs to be a global commitment to doing that, and that is also happening at the COP. Food systems will also be central. They are central. They are a hard nut to crack. There are enormous interests in that. They are cultural, they are personal, they're all of that, but we need to get to that because we understand the energy system necessities quite well. Mobility, there's a good discussion on that. Material circular economy, increasingly well understood. The contribution of biodiversity, yes. Big lacking discussion is on food systems. Yeah? So this is a big one that is there. In a nutshell, short introduction to what a COP is, how it's organized a bit, and what we may expect from Baku. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tarini. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the lovely presentation. I guess one of my questions is, can you speak a little bit about COP28, the outcomes, and how do they play out into like carrying forward into the COP29 discussions? Kind of like, is there like a COP28 to COP29, kind of like a recap, and then you go into it? Or just some of the outcomes that have been really beneficial?
I'm not sure I fully understood you. Okay, well, some of the main results of COP28 was that there was an agreement on this conceptualization of loss and damage, and that we needed a fund for that. The other thing was the global stock take, but now we need to look at what the impact of that will be on ramping up ambition. Health was very important in the previous COP, so I mean, setting up processes for that. The outcome of a COP is always of different types. One is the outcome that is embedded within the logic of a treaty, and that has a follow-up. During a COP, there are also, in my opinion, sometimes ridiculous number of pledges. Yeah, countries pledge this, banks pledge that, multinational corporations pledge another thing, the health sector pledges something else. So usually there's also a meeting of these groupings that have these pledges. Yeah, and then increasingly, this is also the global annual meeting of the scientific community that also advances and follows up. These three separate processes, they all have an ongoing process during the year. If you want to follow what is happening in the proper negotiations, which, by the way, would require, in my opinion, maximum 1,000 people to meet and not 70 or 80,000, that's really the black box of negotiations. Yeah, you can follow that. I mean, the website of the UNFCCC gives you updates. If you want a more distant but well-informed and extremely useful update, IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, they have a track record of following global negotiations and keeping you updated. And there are at least 4 or 5 different channels of daily updates, but also pre-COP updates of here are the important discussions, here's the hyperlink to this document, that document. So there is no shortage of being aware of what is happening there and how that is linked to official process, to the pledge type of process, or to the more scientific or civil society type of processes.
Yep, that answers my question. Thank you.
I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, I see a lot of questions. Pass the microphone.
Hi, my name is Sneha. I'm a student. Thank you so much for your presentation. I guess my question was about like how to negotiate how binding these agreements are. Like I know there's a lot of language around them being binding, but we all know that international law has maybe a lack of like accountability measures. I was wondering if there's any conversations or new thoughts about that.
Yes, lots of conversations and thoughts. I'll start, and then you can add on. I think it's a really important question. I always tell my students, if we had a room full of international lawyers and we said, is this global international treaty legally binding? We would not have agreement in the room. Legal scholars there's no consensus over what really we mean by legally binding, right? We don't have a global police force. We don't have a world government. We have member states who are sovereign. What I think is the particular genius of the way the Paris Agreement has been set up is that it turns to those sovereign states and empowers them to take what path they want to take. So if we assume that countries are writing into their NDCs policies that they intend to adopt, then the legally binding factor happens within the domestic context, right? A country will create a law, pass the law, and now their own systems will hold them legally accountable for accomplishing those tasks. But what happens often is countries make promises and pledges, as we just heard, in their NDCs or in the context of negotiations, and many of those pledges or promises don't make their way into domestic policy because of capacity weakness, domestic politics, all sorts of other reasons. And in those cases, there's very little recourse, right? We can't put a country in jail for not doing what they said they would do, but there's soft power implications for countries that routinely fail to live up to their treaty obligations. But it really does come to the sovereign state and what they choose to do. Would you add?
Yeah. Yes, they are in principle legally binding, but you need a strong implementation mechanism if you're serious about that. You need an enforcement mechanism, and at the end of the day, that would include a sanctioning mechanism. And that is not standard operating procedure in international public law. Yeah? That's a problem. There are parts of international public law where that is the case, but then it's embedded in strong treaties that are not necessarily globally accepted, like the WTO or like some other treaties. But that is clearly a weakness. Translating it into national law is one solution. The EU translates it into legally binding and enforceable European regulation that is then enforced. But a recent wave is legal activism, where citizens or groups take a country to court because it says you have signed a legally binding treaty and the policies that we see here are not responsive in a way that would be implementing this treaty in the way it should be implemented. And that is leading to convictions. That has happened in the Netherlands, it has happened in Belgium, it has happened in Germany. If you want to track that, the London School of Economics has a tracking system for court cases based on these types of treaties and on science and non-compliance at national level, also for companies. Some companies have been taken to court based on that sort of interpretation of internationally legally binding treaties.
I'll also mention that the Sabin Center here at Columbia and the law school has a climate litigation tracker. It's another really good source for tracking this type of action. Yeah.
I was advertising the European version. No, I'm just kidding. I was not aware of that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Couple sources.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Here.
Oh, there we go.
Hi. Thank you. My name is Deep and I'm at the journalism school. I wanted to ask you about how you see the role of journalists who are present at these COP events and how they cover them and what role they play in these negotiations. Sometimes we see stories come out about how, this country blocked this particular article or this particular from coming, effectively vetoing it because you need full consensus there. And as a secondary part to this question, I'm wondering how the role of journalists is changing depending on which country is hosting that event, like how it was when it was in Glasgow versus say in the UAE.
Yeah, of course there is an extensive communications and press link office connected to a COP like that. I mean, you have tens of thousands of people, all these heads of states. You need a seriously organized communication service. Yeah, there are press conferences continuously. There is a big press room, but there is also the press walking around there looking for, people to respond, or so that happens all the time. This is usually well organized in a combination between the experienced secretariat and the host country. Last year, I can tell you, the first 2 days, it was a complete mess. And a friend of mine who is French and who had been doing that during the COP in Paris was on the spot asked by the Dubai presidency, would you take over the press office? And he did, yeah? Out of the blue, he did. Because there have been serious hiccups. But it's a really important role. I think that role is important towards the global audiences as well. It's, as always, a role that can be played, yeah, which is the case with any big event that ends up in the media. Some delegations designate people to take up that role. I am now in the Belgian delegation, and one of the things they asked me is to be the connection also to some media outlets. I've written in our largest newspaper in the past, every day, an 800-word piece on some critical issues. So there is that connection. It's the fourth power, as we know it in political science. Huh? Yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is that the sheer size and scale of the COP, I know I keep saying that, I make motions like this. Like, I cannot even express, it's like going to the Olympics. I think that's the best comparison, where there's multiple venues and lots of things happening. So even if you're there and on site, you cannot possibly know everything that's happening. And I think journalists have a really key role there. For, if I'm at a COP, I go home at the end of the day and still read the news, what happened at the COP, because I didn't see everything, right? I only have access to some rooms. I can only be in one place at a time. So I think journalists really help piece it together in what's otherwise a really sprawling and diffuse event.
Yeah, the fact that it's so big also in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years has led to an enormous influx of lobbyists. Yeah. And that is, in my opinion, damaging the dynamics of part of what is happening. And it's happening in a variety of ways. The last 2-3 years, it's as if part of the badges have been reserved for this nuclear revival that we see. I'm not making a statement on how desirable that is. That's not the place to do it. But all of a sudden, it's big. If that is picked up by media, they are framing what is happening there in reality. If they ignore that, I don't think they do justice to the dynamics of the COP. There are other sectors as well that are present in large numbers. That is also tracked, by the way. You've got those who track the official blue zone delegations and put them in categories. That journalists do that, but also NGO trackers do that. So you can learn quite a bit from those things as well.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, then we'll do the panel, and then we'll have more time for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this. I wanted to focus on loss and damage, what you talked about. With your first, what's your assessment on what could happen with loss and damage discussions in this COP, which is something that a lot of us are paying attention to? And on a separate question about the same topic, due to your experience, what would you do if it was in your power to manage this loss and damage fund? What would be like your guidance or takeaways on this?
I'll say a few quick words about loss and damage. So just to fill in some gaps for those who may not know what this is the idea really being advanced by countries that are experiencing significant loss and damage to property and assets on their territory that are the result of climate change. And the claim by these countries is that we did not emit greenhouse gases, we did not cause climate change to happen, and yet we are suffering the most harm. Who should pay for that, right? That's the loss and damage issue. And this has been sort of lurking in the background in COP for many years, but it really came to the surface 2 years ago in Egypt. There was a preliminary, I think, agreement on principle that maybe the creation of a loss and damage fund would be a way through this. And then countries that are what we might think of as Annex 1 countries, or used to be called Annex 1 countries, would contribute money into the loss and damage fund, and countries that are experiencing loss and damage would receive money from the loss and damage fund. So conceptually, this sounds like a beautiful solution. Implementing that is incredibly complex. So imagine for a minute, you live in I don't know, pick Guatemala, and the country experiences a catastrophic flood, and there's many billions of dollars of damage. Which particle of greenhouse gas that was emitted by Belgium in which year means what portion of that loss and damage they should pay, what portion of that loss and damage the US should pay? How do we calculate who owes money to who? And how do we then get that money and disperse it in ways that are seen collectively to be fair and adequate? It's a bit of an impossible question. It's really a difficult challenge. So in Egypt, when there was agreement on the creation of a fund, they created a transitional committee to study how to operationalize the idea. My understanding is last year that transitional committee came back with some ideas, but it's not fully operationalized yet. And I actually don't know exactly what to expect this year, and maybe you have more updated info.
It's a complicated issue, I mean, of course, yeah. But the commitment is now to operationalize it. And that means at least analytically a couple of categories. One is, what do we understand under loss and damage? That needs to be properly defined, which is not so easy. Then how do we conceptualize of an amount of money that should be brought together to reasonably respond to what we now call loss and damage? And then what sort of procedures do we use to spend that money in a way that is transparent, that is leading to solutions, that follows some basic rules of good governance, and in the coded language, that is in general called rule book negotiations. Yeah, endless, of course, because the devil is in the detail, and is also in the implementation. So that's in principle. The broader issue for me is that this has led to some theoretical commitments to go into this fund. Yeah, but they fall far short of any macro analysis of loss and damage. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think the best loss and damage fund is to finally bend the bloody curve of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, I mean, we have been negotiating climate change for 32 years. We don't see a bending of the curve at all. Yeah? We see a slowing down. The inclination of the curve is decreased a bit. But if we want to prevent unaffordable complex impacts and vulnerabilities of climate change, that's where the logic is, which means not putting together $20 billion in a highly complex fund, but turning a 100 trillion global economy around in a direction of fundamentally sustainable systems of production and consumption. And I know this is not a direct answer to your question, but it's a huge frustration as somebody who deals with system logics at a conceptual level to look at fights over insignificant amounts of money when you compare them to the destructive logic of our global systems of production and consumption. So yes, they are important, but what they mean in terms of turning around the logic of this global economy and whether we can use them as leverage points for that global economy, for me, is much more important than this. But it will be a big thing, a big thing. The GEF, the same. It's always big discussions. A new fund, always big discussions. And are we willing as European taxpayers? Yeah, I use the word Americans like to use, taxpayer. Yeah, are we willing to send a euro to Vanuatu? Theoretically, I think most people would say yes. Of course, we do that. Are we willing to send a euro to one of the bottom 10 countries on the Transparency and Corruption Index? Probably not. Yeah, is that a valid concern? Probably yes. Yeah, not towards individual citizens, but towards systems that will take the money and have to do so. So I'm just adding complication and on complication, but that's what the discussion is about. And that's why it's so difficult to get out of it.
I see more questions. We're going to turn to the second half now, and we'll have a panel, so we'll have more experts up here. So let me invite the panelists up. Come sit. Let me... Okay, so now we have arrived at part 2 of this workshop, and we get even more perspective, so I'm really happy to be moderating this conversation. We're going to leave plenty of time for a Q&A at the end, because I know there were several questions we didn't get to. So I'm going to begin by asking each person, and we'll probably just go in line, down the line, to please introduce yourself, tell us your name, what you're doing here, your experience with COP.
All right, I'll kick things off. So my name is Kalain Hosein. I am a Masters of Arts student in the Climate and Society program here at Columbia. I'm still a practicing journalist. I've covered COP26 virtually, 27 and 28 physically. It was a whirlwind of a time, and I'll leave that for the questions later on. Amina?
Hey, hi guys. My name is Amina. I'm here as a student climate school. I'm still working with United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, part-time, and for Amazon. Don't even ask me a question how I do it, but I'm just doing it. Okay, I participated at COP15, COP21, which was like amazing. But the most important part for me participating in COP, it was COP27, where it was vibrant and very young driven. And we can talk about more about loss and damages also later. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Kruczkiewicz. I am a meteorologist, now a climate scientist, here studying extreme hydrometeorological events and also how to integrate the science around extreme hydrometeorological events into policy and practice. So I've been here at Columbia for 13 years. I've been teaching in the Climate and Society program for, I think, 8 or 9 years. And yeah, I also have an affiliation with the International Red Cross, Red Crescent. So I've been to, this will be my 4th COP this year. I've also been to COP wearing a variety of hats from the humanitarian space, from Columbia perspective. So I think there'll be time to share a little bit more about that. But yeah, my work generally is in the physical climate science space, but also very much at the interface with policy and practice.
Andrew Kamau. I'm at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I run the international part of the Energy Opportunity Lab. I'm a recovering civil servant, and I've been to a few COPs, and I'm very interested in the way the climate discussion is framed with respect to the Group of 77, the non-Group 1 countries, and whether the dog is wagging the tail is wagging the dog, or the dog is wagging the tail from a human development point of view.
I've been introduced.
He's already been introduced. From the end. Okay, so now we know who we have. We have a really good, I think, really interesting lineup with different areas of expertise and different experiences in the COP. So we're going to go back down the line, and I'll ask each of you to share what you are looking to for this experience in COP29 in Azerbaijan. I think many of us will not be there. No, Andy will be there, and Hans will be there. Whether or not you'll be there is kind of beside the point, but what are you expecting? What are you hoping for? What are you afraid of? Tell us what you're seeing out there on the landscape for this upcoming COP.
Okay, I'll kick things off. So I come from Trinidad and Tobago, a small island developing state, and back home, as a journalist, I try to make the issues, the big issues that are happening at COP localized. And one of the issues that got a lot of traction over the last 3 years would have been the issue of loss and damage. We heard a lot about it today. So looking to see what meat sticks on the bones, as Hans put it, at this particular COP. Also, there's the NCQG, the new collective goal on whatever, climate change finance. Yeah, there we go. That specific topic has been an issue for the global south and small island developing states for a long time. Since 2009, there was the pledged commitment of $100 billion a year for climate finance, and that was only met in 2022 when it was supposed to be met in 2020. Keep in mind, we need, based on latest studies, about $2.4 trillion for global and nature-based solutions, climate and nature-based solutions. So where is that going to fall in the whole scheme of things for this particular COP? And how will the global north rebuild trust with the global south? So those are the two big issues. Now, I also come from a space of meteorology. I was a broadcast meteorologist for 5 years. So tracking the early warnings for all initiative, that has been something that I've been following since 2022. So yeah, those are like my three big topics. What I'm afraid of, Azerbaijan has a very terrible history of human rights abuses, specifically towards journalists. In the past year, they've jailed 14 journalists, and you would find the press in Azerbaijan to be pretty much state-run. So while there was concern in Egypt and in Dubai, we had to use special apps. I had a different phone that I wiped when I got there and wiped when I left to prevent tracking. Azerbaijan may be a bit different for security concerns, specifically for journalists. So that would be something that I fear, as well as the possible greenwashing of COP. That was a massive issue in Dubai. You had oil lobbyists everywhere. So pass it on.
All right, thank you. I want to talk about actually my perspective for COPs. The two COPs I participated into, it was either climate diplomacy or climate negotiation. What was really striking into that path, it was especially how 3 blocks was created. I like what Hans said about when people come, when the parties come into COPs, they were ready already. So they have a saying in the United Nations where they say COP starts when COPs ends. From the global south perspective, for instance, I'm from Senegal. I work in Africa most of my professional life. And what happened is every time that COPs start, beginning the year, they have big events, high-level discussion, where like parties come together, talk about what they want, where they want to go, because they mine the power of negotiation on the table, because they're low-developing country. For instance, during COP21, for instance, they have what they call the LMDC, the like-minded developing countries. They came together, and on December 11th, I'll never forget, they sit and did a presentation with France as a mediator, where they talk about those non-negotiable points that Professor Lisa presented, which one is like the CBDR. CBDR, again, don't mind those acronyms, because trust me, you're going to get used to. The CBDR is the common but differentiated responsibilities. So those are presented. And by negotiating, coming together as a big bloc, they were able actually to get France acknowledge their requirements and their demands and bring it to the United States. Again, United States have to always be the child in the room. And of course, we have to go back and forth and have this mediation. It was fantastic. But building upon this Paris, which is amazing, is that we're seeing now more and more young negotiators building up all over the world, especially from Africa perspective. They have training for them, capacity building. And Professor Lisa talked about adaptation, but now I'm going to add about like capacity building, technology transfer, and then we're going to come back to the loss and damages. I agree about what Kalain said, especially about loss and damages. It was amazing how we came up on COP27 about this establishment of the loss and damages. It's a baby step, but we're hoping that it's going to be a giant step, where we're going to be going from 7 or 2 million pledge, that I think it was September 24, to go to the $100 billion that we're expecting yearly. And we know that some experts are saying it's even going to be more. That's another point. For the loss and damages also, I'm so happy to say that actually it's being operationalized, and I heard that one of my compatriots is going to be leading it. I was so happy. It's just the news came up, I think, last month. He's going to start implementing it. And the fear is, how are we going to funnel that money to the people who need it? Like he said, Hensei, we have this corruption idea, but the most important for developing countries, global south countries, is about adaptation. How are we going to adapt? We didn't emit, so mitigation is not our point. Our point is how we're going to adapt and move forward, and how we're going to be linking the mitigation approaches and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. So what does it mean for a climate scientist to go to COP? You know, this is a question that I think about every year. If I'm asked to go, you know, as I said before, I've been to 4, and each time I've represented a different organization, and also kind of wore a different hat in doing that. But from my perspective, like, should a climate science go to COP? Like, what is the role of us to go there? Like, symbolically, it's important to some extent, but what are we actually doing there? And essentially, I could break it down to a few different kind of categories or themes. First, technical backstopping. You know, there's a lot of numbers and data being thrown around, and I mean, to some extent, it's hard to parse out. You know, what are the important data? How do you prioritize different data sets over others, and how do you integrate them into different aspects of not only what's happening at COP, like, for example, if you're representing a delegation or part of a delegation, but also just thinking broader about strategies, you know, in reactions to what's happening at COP. So, for example, the first COP I went to 10 years ago in Paris, or 9 years ago, I was there in support of the goals of the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. And I was there as one of the scientific advisors to promote this idea of early warning systems, forecast-based financing, anticipatory action. It's one of the first times we really made a push. And actually, it began through what Dr. Dale mentioned before, the Development and Climate Days. That was some of the earlier discussions of this topic, and we were trying to energize or just infuse that into some of the other discussions happening, not only as part of COP, but especially on the sidelines. So, and also back in Paris, that was my first time at COP, so I was trying to get a sense of what was happening there, and just all the different dynamics of the many events and sessions and people there. But then there's other elements as well. Sharing ideas. So in the Madrid COP, I think it was 2019, Madrid/Santiago COP, I was there to share some ideas on how to integrate, essentially prioritize different types of financing based on the exceedance of different thresholds that we have identified within forecasts that have been kind of brought into standard operating procedures, specifically related to humanitarian action. So that was sharing some results from scientific projects that were happening. Last year, it was also about supporting the goals of an organization that was funding some of my research. I'm still working with the UNOCHA, which is the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, on the concept of overshoot. So yes, we need to stay under 1.5, but who has the responsibility to think about what the world would look like, what the humanitarian sector would look like if we do exceed, or if those kind of inflection points, as Dr. Bruyninckx was saying, if we perhaps bring down the temperature, but then that period of post-peak, you know, there can be perturbations when we're talking about temperature, globally speaking. So what are some of the questions we should be asking? And some of my work supports some of the thinking around, essentially how to manage and talk about and prioritize different goals specifically related to overshoot. So that's something last year and something this year that I'll also be talking about. But just the last point, and I think this is important too, as a scientist, I also go there to learn. You know, I also go there to build partnerships. I'm in a very privileged position, I think, as a scientist who is conducting climate research, but also present, you know, in the global climate policy space in the humanitarian context as well. So I do find the responsibility, or I acknowledge the responsibility, to go there to listen, to learn, and not just be a scientist inundating people with data, because we have too much data and too little time already, but also being present and doing a lot of listening as well. So those are some of my thoughts about previous COPs and up to this year? Thank you.
I think for me, the COPs are actually quite interesting. I mean, it's like Dr. Dale said, we agreed to meet and talk about it. And there's a lot of talk that goes on, let me tell you. And unfortunately, even though some people will say that the agreements are binding, that the treaties are binding, there is no sanction. There are no sanctions. So if I don't meet it, well, too bad. Next year we can talk about it again on what we're going to do. So you see the $100 billion that was put aside, it actually has never been met. It was supposed to be $100 billion every year. Yeah, it's not 100 billion, and then when we reach 100 billion, it's 100 billion every year. So it's never been met. And actually, we don't talk about the 100 billion anymore because now we've got a new shiny toy called loss and damage. So we can talk about loss and damage. We talked about loss and damage last year, and I went to a pavilion over lunch. I'm not going to name the country's pavilion, and I met the members of that pavilion and other guests sitting around at lunch having a good chuckle that the United States put aside $17 million for loss and damage subject to congressional approval. I mean, a country like Italy put $100 million. So people are not taking this thing seriously. Yeah, and I agree with Hans. One of the problem is how is it operationalized? Who gets the money? What happens in that case? The issue with this whole overshoot, which is not looked at, and Andrea said this, from a humanitarian point of view, you can see what's happening from the Horn of Africa all across the Sahel to Guinea. These are pastoralist communities, so water is very important for livestock. And as this climate situation exacerbates itself, you're finding more conflict in terms of natural resources, water, grasslands, rangelands. And you can see there's been a military coup in all these countries. And it's beyond that also. And I spoke about the whole development angle, is that these are places where you have a large proportion of young people. And those people are waiting for jobs. So they want something that's going to give them meaningful employment. And Hans spoke about this thing. So food systems. How do we deal with food systems? You need to feed yourselves. How's that going to work out? So if you don't have a job and somebody comes and tell you, well, you'll be probably better off in a different system of government, you've got nothing to lose. So let's go with that system of government. Let's have a military coup. Let's disrupt governance. So if it doesn't work out, well, I'm not any worse off than I was before. Yeah. But if you don't have proper governance structures, you don't have credible governments, you're not going to have an orderly transition, and you're definitely not going to take care of climate change. And so you have a whole group of displaced people. And one of the things that we look at the center right now is the whole issue on the humanitarian side of it. Because today there are something like 120 million people in a displaced setting. Yeah? But we don't talk about this enough. So the whole issue on pledges and the lack of enforcement, how we're going to finance, for example, the energy transition, how we're going to produce enough food, how does transportation work. We're getting into a new thing, which will be critical minerals. How's that mining done in an environmentally sound way that includes indigenous people and the people who live on the land? All these are issues that seem to get some discussion, but usually from a very academic level. But once we leave the COP, yes, NDCs are there, UNFCCC is managing this. But I've been involved in putting together NDCs. And usually it's the Ministry of Environment that puts together NDCs with very little input from the National Treasury, who put together the national plans, Ministry of Energy, who then support those national plans, and the Ministry of Transport. So let me give you a very simple example. So 1 out of every 4 people in the world by 2050 will be an African. 13 of the 20 largest cities in the world will be in Africa. Most of them have not been built. There's a shortage of 50 million basic housing units on the continent. All those houses have to be built, and they're not being built with wood. They're being built with cement and steel. Those are emissions. There is no country that has included building materials in their NDCs. So for that reason, there are no emissions. So whatever you want to track is off track already. So when you look at NDCs, and I really encourage you guys, have a look at your specific country's NDCs. You will be shocked. And then next to it, look at your 5-year development goals. They don't talk to each other. And you wonder why we are not on track.
I agree with a lot that has been said, so I'll bring 3 really brief other things. First of all, there is a pre-COP event that takes place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in this country. I think it will be discussed at the COP, depending on who will be our next president. That will have an impact on negotiations and what people can expect. And that's regime theory. Expectations matter in shaping actors' behavior, so I think that's important. The second thing that I hope for is finally a credible path at the latest in 2030 to peak emissions. To peak emissions, we need a credible path. That's where these commitments, these ramped up ambitions should land at this COP. And the third thing is that, yes, there is an implementation gap and there is an ambition gap and there is all sorts of gaps. But increasingly, my conviction is that we have an ethics gap. And that has to do with the humanitarian situation, with a bunch of other things that have come to the floor here. And I would hope that the sort of ethical responsibility and the ethical irresponsibility over the last 30 years would be on the table in a more open and direct fashion, because to me that's absolutely critical if we want to be serious about the global impacts that we can expect.
Thanks. That was a really fascinating overview. Ideally, I'd like to use the remainder of the time to answer questions from the audience. If we have a shortage of questions, I've got plenty. But let's start here. There's one right here.
Hi. So my question is for Andrew, to the left. So you said that there's a big disconnecting in the NDCs and then what the actual plan is, as well as how it's done by the climate sector of a government and not in connection with the other ones that actually make the plans and implement the projects. If you could wave your hand and make those things work, how would you do that? And or how would you direct students trying to do those ambitions to do those kind of things?
I think because there's no real incentive to put together proper NDCs for some of these countries, then people don't put the resources. Because governments have got serious priorities. They've got education, they've got healthcare, they've got infrastructure, food delivery, and then there's the climate issue. And it doesn't look like, even if I put a proper NDC in place, because the NDCs usually, so the way the NDC looks like, if they say, look, this is our ambition, this is what we're going to do, but if we want to move the needle from what they call business as usual scenario to this new scenario, which is based on reducing our emissions by whatever they commit, I need $10 billion. They know the $10 billion is not coming, but I'll put it in there anyway, and then I'll move on with my work. Because, like Hans said, and in fact, I think it was Dr. Dale said, we are living now in we're developing democracy. So we're asking people to have regular elections. So every 5 years, I have to have an election. Some of these things are beyond the election cycle. So if I need to deliver 200,000 basic housing units to my citizens. But if I do something that will allow reduced of emissions and have better building material, I may have to wait 10 years to build those 200,000 houses. I'm not going to make it beyond that election cycle. I'm going to get voted out. So what do? I do what is required now to deliver the services, and then we can deal about the other issue later.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Okay, I agree with Andrew, but I'm just going to bring a different perspective. 2 years ago, I participated in the Senegal.
Hold your mic closer.
Senegal updating their NDCs. So the approach was Senegal is like have coastal cities like Dakar, its capital. We are the peninsula, and actually we are on the brink of like really sinking. That was the latest studies. And the NDCs, we make sure that we have this sectoral combination, which means transportation, health system, and they were all present when we're doing the NDCs. And each one of them brought something on the table because of the geographical situation of Dakar and how those cities are losing and how much money Senegal is losing in terms of damage and loss, especially livelihood. Because there was a mistake since 2003 was made by the government, and they tried to cashing up because one of the city almost disappeared because they opened a bridge and just like flooded all the urban land. So the NDCs is for sure that when we make them, it's just numbers we bring up, and we just want to be like, let's move on because we have more priorities. But at this point, most of the coastal cities, I think flooding is one of their main concerns. So they try to put in all those sectoral planning together and try to pull up something at least trustworthy as like NDCs.
Can I just jump in there on Senegal? Senegal is about to become a oil and gas producer. And part of the whole issue on West Africa and the Gulf of Guinea is, yes, you're producing the oil, but this is the region with the highest form of gas flaring in the world. And people don't look at that as part of their NDCs, because they say, well, the oil company says, I'm going to produce the oil, but usually the gas belongs to the state. But then the state says, okay, we don't have a use for it right now, so you have to flare it. And it's nowhere in the NDCs. No West African country or East African country has put in gas flaring or fugitive emissions of methane in their NDCs as part of their emissions.
More questions? There's one.
Hi, thanks for the conversation. This is awesome. And Professor Dell and Professor Andrew, it's great to hear your lectures again. Mr. I recently graduated from Columbia Climate School, so I'm kind of curious for you guys as a climate scientist or environmental scientist, how do you curate yourself into this sort of political dialogue? Because I still think COP is rather bureaucracy, create political dialogue. Do you have any tips for those who want to get a career into the global environmental governance? And overall, how do you enjoy the experience? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, I will start.
Great.
Thank you, and great to see you. So I remember when the Red Cross first asked me to go to COP, I didn't really know what that meant. Go to COP. I didn't really understand the ask, but I asked around my colleagues and like, wow, that's so great to get to go to COP. And I'm like, what does this actually mean? So I took it upon myself to ask many more questions to the Red Cross, basically like what are my roles and responsibilities and what will they look like? What is the timeline? How do I prepare? All these things, and it made me, it was a pivotal moment in my career, as I was starting to think a lot more about what is my responsibility as a scientist in the humanitarian space or interacting in development or just moving beyond writing publications for peer review. How do I appropriately represent science? At the COP, do people really care about my latest paper on flash flood modeling, which is what I published on? Even though I think it's so great, and I think it's so important. And the answer is not really, right? I mean, maybe in certain sessions, there could be a session on flood modeling or flood risk, and maybe some people will care. But my task there was to support the delegation of the Red Cross, essentially, how to navigate the inundation of data that was happening even back then. 10 years ago was kind of the start of this climate tech kind of world. I guess the start date is debatable, but even back then, data was becoming increasingly available. I don't want to say old days, but the previous decades of difficulty in accessing data and kind of analyzing data in different ways, that was decreasing. And now the humanitarian sector, at least the groups I was working with, were having trouble like, okay, well, these are 5 models of flood risk in 2050, 2070, 2100. They all come from reputable sources. They all come from either private sector companies that we all know, or universities that we all know, or even space agencies. Like, how do we deal with this? Do we merge them? Do we blend them? How do we average them? How do we pick one? And increasingly that's my role in a setting such as COP or in the run-up to COP. And I think that's one way that I initially, as a student studying climate science and meteorology, never really thought that would be my role in this space. I would still think it was like, no, just write a good paper and then give a good talk, and then people would see the science and know what to do with it, right? But there's an increasing need for scientists to engage more on the interface and kind of translate and integrate and communicate the science in a way that can be understood and acted on by the groups you're going there. So the last thing I'll say is, every time I've gone, I've kind of represented or supported a different organization or organizations. And the way that I do that translation and integration is very different depending on who I'm working with or what my tasks are. And that changes. And actually, I'm thinking the past couple of weeks about this current COP, how I'm going to do that in the most effective way. But anyways, these are just some of the ideas. Yes, science is important, but if you're interested in going to COP as a scientist, I would think much more about how your engagement might be different other than just kind of doing good data analysis and writing a good kind of analytical publication.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I think if you're a scientist and you want to be connecting to this sort of process, you don't have to, but you could think as a continuum from science to policy, and you can position yourself in different places. And some scientists, they choose to work for institutions that are specialized on having one foot in science, but integrating that science in a knowledge base that is structured and specialized to speak to policymakers. It's a specialization in and of itself. Normal scientists are not trained to speak to policymakers, and policymakers are definitely not trained to listen to regular scientists. So that boundary organization that can link them can be really important, which is sometimes what the EPA does here, what the European Environment Agency did. We had mostly people with a PhD in science, but that wanted to work in an organization specialized in translating, transforming, and using that science to embed it in a stable system of knowledge, speaking to policymakers. Whereas if you get a project on a topic, you get funding for 4 years, you gather data, the project is done. You need to move to some other project because you have 2 researchers that you want to keep on board. The data gets lost, it's not embedded into a system, and then what is left is to impact publications. So there are other ways to connect to the policy-making community. And voila, this is one other way. And the US has a lot of good institutions to do that, going from NOAA to the EPA, but also in some think tanks that embed people with your type of education and background to speak to the policymaking community.
Hi. Thank you for this. I'm a student at Teachers College, so I have a few questions that are not directly related, but of course within the larger purview. The first is, I did hear that there are some discussions about going beyond GDP as a measure for countries. So I just want to ask if there are any discussions on alternative thinking or, looking at well-being economics or looking at basically representing different views. Are there any, anybody doing those kind of discussions? I'm also quite tuned into the entire UNCOP movement, which is really about a lot of the alternate movements that are happening that kind of recognize, the lack of action or the lack of, I guess the where there is a lot of potency of smaller groups aligning and having alliances, maybe around like indigenous communities. Is there this kind of alternate representation at all?
On just the first part, are there ways to measure and integrate post-normal GDP thinking? The answer is yes. It's happening in several institutions. I mean, the OECD is sort of the cathedral of traditional economic thinking. They are working on post-GDP, beyond GDP work. It's happening in Europe, and there is also a global standard now, for example, of natural capital accounting that has been agreed and that has been applied. And that speaks to national accounts in the traditional way. So there are ways of bringing that into the discussion. This is happening. The European Statistical Office is doing it for all the member states. So the answer is yes, but I'll keep it short. Yeah.
Anyone else want to add to that question?
The only thing I can say about the UNCOP movement is that is there, but when I asked a question, just a quick answer, I asked a question to Citron Rodriguez about it. The answer was, if we do a parallel COP, how are we going to be having voice in the real COP? Because the real COP, this is where all decisions are made, okay? When you get in, like my mentor said, when you get in this complexity, the first question you ask yourself, who wants what? That's how you can navigate into it, and that's how you can bring yourself to put your demands or your requirement on the table. So UNCOP movement is good, just like to voice some concern, but it's a must for everybody to participate in the COP. Yeah.
Question? Yeah.
Hi, hello. It's me again. I wanted to. So a lot of the decision making at COP would be based on forecasts about the future, whether it's forecasting sea level rise, temperature rise, migration because of climate change, and number of kind of futuristic predictions. And I'm curious for all of you, what are your most trusted sources of these types of predictions? Who do you think has the best, most robust methodology to make these kind of predictions about the future and forecasts? Yeah.
Great question. Who wants to tackle that one?
I can start. As a journalist, what sources I use for that, and really it would be the IPCC. The IPCC is the leading and probably gold standard for consensus science on the projections, and they have level of confidence attached to each of the projections that they show. And their reports are pretty long, but they do have summary statements you have regional fact sheets that are quite digestible. You also have the executive summaries for policymakers. So as a student, that probably will be the best one, unless you want to read a 1,000-page document. Go for it. Yeah.
Anyone have a different answer than the IPCC?
Context. So no, I'm not going to say don't use the IPCC. I will say yes, definitely IPCC. But also it depends too. I mean, the IPCC doesn't cover everything. There's certain types of floods, for example, that happen in some areas that may not be, represented in the specific way that one is thinking about it. Also, if you're thinking about multi-hazards, and how hazards are interacting in space and time, perhaps the IPCC does not have a robust kind of description of the risk of different hazards interacting on all time scales, on all spatial scales, direct and indirect impacts, things like that. So I think, yes, IPCC is definitely like the starting point for many questions, but then it might require a further pursuit or an additional pursuit, depending on the level of specificity you're looking for. And then I'd say the source definitely matters, but just be prepared that there is a a trend, I'd say, for a, I don't know, there's many maps, you know. Sometimes I remember a quote from one of the COP in Dubai, and I was on a panel, a World Meteorological Organization panel, actually on the early warnings for all initiative, and I was with actually a former Columbia graduate, Ousmane Nadai, who's the director of the Senegalese Meteorological Service, and we were talking, and he goes, yeah, Andrew, you know, there's so many maps, and then one of those person in the audience goes, there's too many maps and there's too little time. You know, and I think this statement sticks with me. And on one hand, it requires a more appropriate representation of kind of the constraints of what those maps are showing or intending to show. But I think also to Dr. Bruyninckx's point, policymakers aren't trained, you know, in the interpretation of these products either. So just as an aside, but I think also related, a lot of my work is on scientists needing to more appropriately represent both the benefits and shortcomings of data, but I'm also pushing the humanitarian sector when I can, that we need to enhance the skills and the capacities, so at the very least the right questions are being asked. A critical lens is being placed when the new climate tech app is saying we have the best flood forecast projections inch by inch globally in 2100, right? It's like there needs to be a higher bar of kind of questioning some of these claims. So yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think a lot about the questions that you're asking.
Question.
Hi. So my question is to the panel in general. When we talk about emissions, we obviously cannot ignore the private sector. I was of the assumption that COP was primarily the governments and the public sector. And it wasn't until I worked for like McKinsey, I realized there's so much resources being put into being present at COP. So I'm curious to understand how much do they weigh in these discussions? What's their involvement? Are they in the blue zone? And how does this play about? Are they helping governments, or is it their own private agenda?
Great question about role of the private sector at the COP. Who wants to start with that one? Hans?
Maybe I can take that one. I was in Nairobi 2 weeks ago with the UN Global Compact in a meeting with CEOs, and I was asking them, okay, guys, how many of you know what your NDCs say? You know, because I mean, you know, it's private sector is supposed to be the engines of job creation, industrialization, but they're not involved in the formulating of these NDCs. Yet, we're going to tell them how much they're going to emit. So it means how much they're going to spend to stop their current or to mitigate their current growth or growth in emissions, while, of course, growing their industries. Because governments want your tax money. Yeah, so they hope you will grow. They will put in systems that will help you to grow. But at the same time, you have to limit your emissions. So yes, private sector should be involved, but they should be involved like what Dr. Dale was saying, in the way that each country has there should be at the country level. That's where they should be discussing these things, so that when the negotiations start happening, in the back of the mind, the government knows this is what I need to develop from a private sector, and this is how much I can give away in terms of emissions.
Yeah, they're all over the COP. I mean, if you looked at the ranking of the last COP in Dubai, the largest delegation by sector was the oil and gas industry. Yeah, that was the largest delegation. So they are all over, including the big consulting companies, including the big infrastructure companies. And that's understandable because, I mean, decisions are made about the future and their role in the future. But the critical political economy perspective on that is, of course, how much impact and influence do they have on the direction of the decision, on the targets that are set, and on the speed? Because we're talking as scientists about the need to speed up and scale up solutions in this pivotal decade, as we call this decade in science, and to avoid this and that and the other. But that can be translated in actual sense of direction, speed, and scale. To what extent are they there to slow that down, or to keep it in another direction? That is, for me, the real question. But they're all over the place, embedded in some delegations, heading some delegations. I mean, there are oil producing countries where the head of the delegation is the CEO of an oil company. Okay, so that happens, and there are those that take an opposite view. So they are there, yeah, by definition.
But I think that's just one sector. Private sector is huge.
Yeah.
It's huge.
All of them are there.
And I think, one of the things that we also have to of course, be careful is that each country has to take care of its own interests. Yeah, that's very, very important to note. Because, like I said, these are people who each country is run by politicians. And they're hoping to get elected. I remember one prime minister told me your only job in your first term is to get elected in your second term. That's your only job. So you have to obviously make sure that your policies come in place. Now, I really have to say the Europeans have done a super job because they've put together systems, things like the carbon border management adjustment mechanism. They've put in cap and trade. They've put in a lot of systems, even though they have big oil companies. But they're working towards something that helps the planet, not just their own economies. And I think a lot of people can learn from what the Europeans are doing. Now, of course, if you are in a country where you're an oil-producing country, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, and 80% of your revenues for education, healthcare, all come from the oil sector, it's a whole other different situation. You can't just say, well, for the sake of the planet, we, country X, will no longer produce oil, or we're not going to, we're going to ramp this thing completely down in the next 5 years. You will have a revolution. So you have to think about one way or the other, what should I do? It's very important that this discussion has to be nuanced into where you come from and what are your situation.
I see a question over here. I see a question back there. Oh, we've got a mic.
Okay. So I'm a part of SPS. I'm actually an energy engineer. I've been doing this for about 10 years. So it's really on a minuscule level. I've been accounting, carbon emissions for a while for the built environment. So, I just from getting your global perspective, there's a lot of focus from your end about just giving some of the funds to democratic countries, right? But as we see, we have here a very strong democracy, right? But as we saw, we pulled out of the Paris Accord, right? So is that something that's being discussed in the COP where democracy is it more important than actually pledging to reduce the emissions?
No, but if you are representing the EU, then that is a valid discussion, because if you contribute to a system, we don't call it democracy at that level. You talk about governance systems and rule of law and the rule book and transparency. Those are all issues that are talked about, and they matter if you are involved in these discussions as Europe. So that's the position that we take, knowing very well that, this is not the position of the people in charge of a number of the other parties at the COP. But that's the world in which we have to negotiate. Yeah, that's the reality.
I think that is a very good distinction. It's governance. Democracy just happens to be one of the systems. There are very many corrupt countries that have regular elections. And I'm sure all of you can name a few. That is not the issue. The issue is about governance. How transparent is the system? Even if you run your own independent system outside the democratic system. I think one of the things that people always forget, and I just discovered this the other day, is that one of the SDGs is SDG 16. building strong institutions. If we can do that, irrespective of what your traditional system is, I think then you can have a transparent race. So if I put in money into a system, I know it's going through the resilience or to mitigation or to adaptation that it said it was going to do.
But it comes down, again, the devil is in the details. For example, I mean, external reviews of the data that you submit to the UNFCCC, yeah, based on the tables that you need to fill in. This is really expert work. Yeah, I had 2 colleagues who were part of the international team that went to colleagues and reviewed that. We were reviewed as the European agency that was doing this for 27 countries. I cannot tell you the discussions with China on what is an external review, who is allowed to look at that, what is the data that is disclosed and transparent. I mean, completely different type of discussion than you would have with the Environment Agency. So these things matter. This is about transparency. How much trust is there in a system? And without trust, you cannot build proper governance. Transparency builds trust, and trust builds the institutional capacities to have proper governance. And that's what, in essence, these discussions are about and why they are so difficult.
Question.
Hi. First of all, this was great. Like, this has been amazing. And I'm reading right now a book named The Ministry for the Future. Such a great book. I mean, everyone should read it. It's basically about this. And I guess that one of our nature as humans is that we need some kind of sanction, right? In order to do something. And it's just how like systems work. It's so sad, but it is the reality. So I'm thinking, okay, if there is no sanction of getting the objectives or meeting the NDCs, then like, how do we do it? Like, how do we do it? Because it's just like talking again and talking again with all these people and trying to engage everyone. And it's like, it's a whole system and it's the whole world, right? But how do we get people to move in the same direction? I know that every country has their own interests. And of course, because we all have different necessities and we all have different capacities, but then how? This is just like, I don't know.
This is a great closing question, and I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on this. How do we do this? I think this is a great way to wrap up the panel. So maybe we'll go down the line and we'll start here. How do we do this? How do we do this better if you are in charge of the world?
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't be president of the world. But I would say that that's a part of that puzzle could be the role of the media, right? Holding institutions accountable to the pledges that they make. And I'll use a really great example that I had to implement, unfortunately, in COP27. Prime Minister of my country was supposed to lead the delegation, but instead, the Minister of Planning and Development showed up, and he went to London instead of Egypt to negotiate gas sharing and agreements and get an LNG train from BP up and running in Trinidad. Meanwhile, you have the Minister of Planning and Development saying, yeah, we're going to cut emissions. And also, simultaneously, at that point in time, Trinidad and Tobago experienced one of its worst floods in recent decades. So, showing the hypocrisy of the leaders, stating what the official position is at COPs or elsewhere, and then writing a story, really laying it out for the public of what's going on, you get a lot of public outrage. And that's part of the democratic process of holding your leaders accountable. So I think the role of the media is really important in doing it better.
With respect to what Andrew said and Dr. Hans, I think the most important part, on my perspective, is the capacity building. There has a disconnect between the policymakers and the science. So, for instance, my work with the United Nations, it was more about capacity building, actually at the institutional level, training those policymakers to make sure that they mainstream or they integrate the SDGs into their policies, and also train the youth, especially young negotiators, and make sure that they understand where we're coming from and where we're going. A key also important training that we did, and I think that it paid off a lot, is actually about governance, teaching those young people that they have a voice, especially youth, that can change. Governance, for instance, that's the most, I think, one of our barrier in Africa, where like people were supposed to sit are not sitting. Even the COP, people are being on the COP, in the COP, for instance, from Senegal, they're not usually trained for it. They just go because they belong to the party in the power. So they don't discuss, they don't negotiate properly. But the last year, we're seeing more and more young people going to be trained, policymakers being trained, and then participating more in expert group meetings where they have more impact, where they have more resolution than the ministerial or high-level meeting.
So I'm going to start off with my thoughts on what's not going to work. Actually, maybe not what's not going to work, but essentially, as a scientist, it was, it's not a specific moment necessarily, but realizing that data alone won't solve these problems, right? And I think it's important to keep in mind, especially as a scientist, but I think no matter what you're working on related to climate, data has inherent biases, right? Data represents some climate and meteorological processes better than others. Data misrepresents impact, particularly for the most vulnerable and traditionally underserved populations. Like, we know these things. We know data has these biases and constraints, yet still, I feel, and from my experience, it's not presented as such in certain types of discussions and in certain types of policy dialogues. I know the IPCC does a good job at kind of outlining some of these, but my experience at COPs over the years is that there's less space to have more critical discussions around what these data or what the data being presented represent, what they don't represent, and what they misrepresent. And even if a climate solution, is presented as such, a climate solution for who? If the bigger picture here is to support the most vulnerable populations, the most underserved populations, and actually decrease the disproportionality of impact which those populations experience, if that's the metric we're actually trying to decrease and minimize, then many times, both in the climate and physical data, the extreme events aren't well accounted for or captured in the models that we use. And then also from the socioeconomic data side, it's the same. Many times there's a disincentive to appropriately capture the socioeconomic aspects within the data that is used in some of the reporting and monitoring metrics. So I think that's something to keep in mind that I encourage you all to think about. On the other hand, what am I hopeful for? I mean, from my experience teaching, I'm constantly inspired by students. I'm not sure if everyone is a student here. I don't think so, but just the climate school students. I think you're very uniquely positioned, at the intersectionality of science, policy, and practice. And I think that's really what we need more of. We need more people to translate across those interfaces, to know how to integrate, to know how to ask the right questions. And yeah, I encourage you all, if this is an area of interest, to pursue it, because it's exactly what the climate school kind of embodies, which is what we need more of.
I think there was a very good point that was made at the beginning of this panel and also at the beginning of the talk about equal responsibilities for equal, what was it? What did you call it, the acronym?
Common but differentiated responsibilities.
Common and differentiated responsibilities. Because without that, there is a sense of injustice. Yeah. So if there's a really interesting article I read the other day, it actually some time back, it says my fridge consumes more power than 1 billion people on the planet. So And then the emissions, I think the IEC, the International Energy publication that came out 2 weeks ago, 2024, is looking at what can we do to mitigate some of these issues. I think equity, justice, this is going to be the biggest thing. And somehow, if you pledge, if there's a way we can calculate how much the emissions are due to this whole loss and damage issue. And then on the other side, how is it that we can prevent the money being taken elsewhere? There's transparency in the system so that the money goes where it's supposed to go. If we can do those things, I think then we will be well on our way to meeting this 2 degrees. And if we're not, then, God help us. I think the human being has a huge capacity. Just look what happened to COVID, because we all thought we were going to die anytime. We did some incredibly crazy things. And I think if we really thought this climate change thing was urgent and it was real, we would also be doing some crazy things.
Yeah, building on that, I think we will change either by disaster or by design, to put it very simply. And as a scientist, I think we can contribute to understanding what this design path of change could look like. Not with a 100% chance of success, not that we know it all, but we can contribute to framing pathways, transition pathways along that way. And for me, what is absolutely central is not the technology, because it's mostly there, is not the money. There's more than enough money in the global economy. It is to make people the central point, starting point of all of these policies. And then you come to issues of justice, you come to issues of sufficiency, in the rich countries or those with a rich lifestyle, which is not the same thing necessarily. I mean, you ask different questions. For me, the question is, what does it mean to improve people's lives, to implement the type of transitions that we are talking about? Better food, access to mobility, basic infrastructure, a decent house, healthcare, but also on our side, not being manipulated into excessive consumption. I mean, all of those things are about people. And if we don't make it about people, I think we will fail miserably. And there are those with a strong interest to make it about technology and other things. Technology is important, but at the end of the day, we can't change the laws of physics, but we can change some basic assumptions about how we deal with societal issues. It's about people.
Couldn't think of a better way to wrap this up. So thanks, I learned so much. Thanks to all of you for the great questions. And I think some of us will be sticking around after if you have additional comments. Thanks so much for your time.